She stood at the head of the long dining table, her gloved fingers resting against the polished mahogany, her heart beating with a fragile, stubborn hope. It was the first formal dinner she had hosted as Duchess of Ravencroft, and she had spent days preparing every detail. The candles flickered warmly, the silver gleamed, and the scent of roses from the estate gardens drifted through the open windows. She had even chosen a gown of soft ivory silk, one that made her dark hair shimmer like brushed ink under the chandelier light. Her husband, Cassian Blackwood, the Duke of Ravencroft, sat at the opposite end of the table. He had not looked at her once since the guests arrived. His attention belonged entirely to the woman seated at his right hand, Lady Marguerite Ashby, a golden-haired beauty whose laughter rang out like tiny silver bells. Serafina lifted her glass, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "To my husband, and to the prosperity of Thornwood Hall. May our home always welcome those we hold dear." The guests raised their glasses with polite murmurs. Cassian's gray eyes flicked toward her, cold as a winter sea. He did not lift his glass. Instead, he turned deliberately to Lady Marguerite and raised it high, his deep voice cutting through the quiet rustle of silk and breath. "To Lady Marguerite, whose grace and charm bring light to every room she enters, Thornwood is brighter for your presence." A stunned silence fell, then a few nervous chuckles. Lady Marguerite lowered her lashes with a practiced, modest smile. Serafina felt the heat of humiliation rush up her throat. She remained standing, her glass still extended, her arm beginning to tremble. For a long, slow moment, no one looked at her. She was invisible again, the Duchess who stood in her own home and was seen by no one. She lowered the glass, set it gently on the table, and sat down. She did not weep. She did not flee. But something deep inside her chest, something that had been clinging to hope with bleeding fingertips, finally let go. She felt it drop into a hollow, silent place within her, and she knew with a quiet, devastating clarity that she would never beg for his affection again. After that night, Serafina stopped waiting for her husband to love her. She stopped hovering near his study door, hoping he would invite her in. She stopped dressing in the colors he once mentioned he admired. She stopped searching his face for even a flicker of warmth. Instead, she began to fill her days with tasks that had nothing to do with him. The estate of Thornwood Hall was vast, its lands dotted with tenant farms and a small village that had fallen into quiet neglect. The previous Duchess, Cassian's mother, had been a gentle and generous woman, but after her death the charitable works had faded away. Serafina began to walk the lanes herself, visiting the cottages, listening to the farmers' wives, nodding the leaking roofs and the children who shivered without proper coats. She did not announce her efforts. She simply began. She organized repairs. She arranged for firewood deliveries. She set aside a room in the village meeting house and began teaching girls to read and sew, their bright eyes fixed on her with something she had not felt in a long time: admiration, gratitude, respect. When she returned to Thornwood Hall in the evenings, her hands were often ink-stained or chilled from the outdoor air, but her heart felt steadier than it had in months. Cassian noticed none of it. He was often away, riding with his steward or closeted with Marguerite, whose visits grew increasingly frequent. Serafina made no complaint. She instructed the housekeeper to prepare the blue guest room for Lady Marguerite whenever she wished, and she arranged for the best cuts of meat and the finest wine to be served. She did this not out of meekness, but out of a serene, unshakable dignity. She would not be reduced to a jealous wife. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. One afternoon, as the first crisp leaves of autumn tumbled across the drive, a visitor arrived. Mr. Nathaniel Wren was a portrait painter of some renown, a man with gentle eyes the color of warm tea and a quiet, unhurried manner. He had been commissioned, through the Duke's London solicitor, to paint a portrait of the Duchess. Serafina was puzzled when the housekeeper informed her. She had not requested a portrait, but she would not refuse a gift, however unexpected. Nathaniel set up his easel in the east parlor, where the light fell soft and golden through tall windows. At their first sitting, he studied her with an artist's care, his head tilted slightly, his brush held lightly in long fingers. "Forgive me, your grace," he said, his voice low and kind, "but you hold yourself as if you are expecting a blow. I shall not give you one. I only wish to capture what is true." Serafina's throat tightened. No one had spoken to her with such quiet perception in all the months since her wedding. She straightened her spine, drew a slow breath, and met his gaze. "Then paint what you see, Mr. Wren. I will not hide from it." Over the following weeks, the sitting room became a place of unexpected peace. Nathaniel did not flatter her with false compliments. He simply worked, and while he worked, he asked her gentle questions. Not about the Duke, not about society, but about her childhood, her favorite books, the meadows she had loved as a girl. Slowly, Serafina found herself smiling. She began to look forward to the quiet hours beside the window, the soft scratch of the brush on canvas, the low murmur of his voice. Cashin did not visit the east parlor. He passed by once, his boots heavy in the corridor, and paused for a fraction of a moment before walking on. Serafina's heart gave a small, stubborn flutter, but she did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on the autumn garden beyond the glass, and when Nathaniel told her to tilt her chin just a little higher, she did so without hesitation. The first time Cashin felt the sharp edge of jealousy, he did not recognize it. He only knew that something had shifted in his household, something that unsettled him like a stone in his boot. He came in from a long ride and heard laughter drifting from the east wing. Not the polite, restrained laughter of a duchess entertaining a guest, but genuine, warm, musical laughter. He found himself walking toward it, his jaw tight. Through the half-open door, he saw his wife seated in a velvet chair, her dark hair loose over one shoulder, her cheeks flushed with amusement. The painter was showing her something on a small sketchpad, his head bent close to hers, their shoulders almost touching. Serafina laughed again, and it was a sound Cashin had never heard from her. It struck him somewhere beneath the ribs, a dull, confusing ache. He stepped into the doorway. Both looked up. Nathaniel rose and bowed respectfully. Serafina's smile faded only slightly, settling into a composed, courteous expression that was far worse than outright coldness. "Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly even, "is there something you need?" The question was simple, but it landed like a slap. She was not asking him to stay. She was not inviting him to join them. She was treating him like a guest who had wandered into the wrong room. He stared at her for a moment, searching for the woman who had once looked at him with such timid, desperate hope. He could not find her. "No," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Nothing at all." He turned and walked away, but the image stayed with him. Her laughter, her ease, the painter's quiet devotion. That night Cashin sat alone in his study, a glass of brandy untouched before him, and felt the first cold whisper of a fear he refused to name. Days passed, and Serafina continued to change. The villagers began to speak of her with genuine affection. The baker's wife left fresh bread at the kitchen door with a note of thanks. The blacksmith's son, who had nearly lost his arm to a fever, was recovering under a physician Serafina had summoned from the county seat. She spent less and less time at the hall, and when she was home, she was often writing letters, planning improvements, or sitting in the library with a book of agricultural methods that the steward had lent her. Marguerite, by contrast, seemed to be everywhere. She draped herself over chaises, murmured intimate things into Cashin's ear during tea, and once she deliberately knocked over a vase of flowers Serafina had arranged, apologizing with a simpering smile. Serafina simply picked up the vase, handed it to a maid, and continued her conversation with the housekeeper about winter blankets for the tenants. She did not flinch. She did not retaliate. She simply refused to be drawn into a battle she had no interest in winning. This infuriated Marguerite more than any outburst could have. She had expected tears, accusations, a slow crumbling of the Duchess's spirit. Instead, Serafina grew more serene, more radiant, more entirely indifferent to the Duke's comings and goings. The servants noticed, the guests noticed, and eventually Cashin noticed. One evening, a small gathering was held at Thornwood to celebrate the successful harvest. Local gentry filled the drawing room, and Serafina moved among them with quiet grace, her gown a deep forest green that made her eyes look like dark pools of honey. She knew the names of every farmer and his wife, asked after their children, and laughed easily at their stories. Cashin stood near the fireplace, watching her. She did not look at him, not once. When Nathaniel Wren approached her and bowed, her entire expression softened. He asked if she would honor him with a turn about the room, and she accepted with a smile that held no artifice. As they walked slowly past the windows, their heads inclined toward each other in quiet conversation, Cashin's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles went white. Lady Marguerite appeared at his elbow, her voice like syrup. How charming they looked together. One might almost forget she is a married woman. The remark, intended to wound Serafina, struck Cashin instead. He set his glass down with a sharp click and strode across the room. He did not interrupt the pair, but he positioned himself near enough that, when Nathaniel finished speaking, Cashin's voice cut through the murmur. "My Duchess, a word if you please." Serafina looked up, her eyes unreadable. She excused herself from Nathaniel with a gentle touch to his sleeve, a gesture that made Cashin's blood simmer. She followed him into the quiet corridor beyond the drawing room. The candles flickered in their sconces, casting wavering shadows across the floor. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "That painter," Cashin said, his voice low and taut. "He is here too often. People are beginning to talk." Serafina tilted her head, studying him as if he were a puzzle she had lost interest in solving. "Mr. Wren was commissioned by your own solicitor. If his presence troubles you, perhaps you should speak to the man who arranged it." Cashin's jaw clenched. He had no memory of ordering any portrait, and the realization unsettled him. But before he could press further, Serafina spoke again, her voice quiet and steady as a river stone. "I have done nothing improper, and I will not apologize for enjoying the company of someone who treats me with kindness. If that is all, Your Grace, I should return to our guests." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the corridor with a storm of emotions he could not control. He wanted to call her back. He wanted to demand she look at him the way she had looked at that painter. But he had no right. He had forfeited every right months ago, on the night he had lifted his glass to another woman and left his wife invisible. The turning point came 2 weeks later, on a gray afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy with unshed rain. Serafina had walked to the village alone, carrying a basket of medicines for a sick child. She was returning along the muddy lane when a carriage came rattling too fast around the bend. The driver shouted, the horses shied, and Serafina leaped back, slipping on the wet stones and falling hard against the hedgerow. She lay there for a dazed moment, her ankle throbbing, her palms scraped raw. The carriage did not stop. She tried to rise, but a sharp pain shot through her leg, and she sank back breathless, the basket scattered in the mud around her. It was Nathaniel who found her, coming along the lane with his sketchbook under his arm. He dropped to his knees beside her, his face pale with alarm. "Your Grace, don't move. I'll carry you back." Before she could protest, he had lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing, and he carried her all the way to Thornwood Hall, his steady strides eating up the distance. Serafina clung to his shoulders, her head swimming, and when they reached the front door, the servants swarmed around them, calling for the physician. Cashin appeared at the top of the stairs, his face carved from stone. He saw his wife cradled in another man's arms, her dress torn and mudded, her face white with pain. Something inside him snapped. He descended the stairs 2 at a time and took her from Nathaniel without a word, his movements surprisingly gentle. "Send for the doctor," he ordered, and carried her to her chambers himself. He laid her on the bed and stood back as her maid rushed to remove her ruined slippers. For a long moment he simply looked at her, his chest heaving with an emotion he could not contain. She was so pale, so small against the pillows, and the thought of her lying alone in the muddy lane, hurt and helpless, made his throat close. "You should not have gone alone," he said. his voice harsh with fear. Serafina opened her eyes. They were hazy with pain but still clear enough to hold his gaze. "I have been alone for a very long time, Cassian. I am used to it." He flinched as if she had struck him. She closed her eyes again and the physician arrived, bustling him out of the room. He stood in the corridor, his back pressed against the cool wall, and felt the ground shift beneath him. He had done this. He had pushed her away so thoroughly that she no longer expected anything from him, not even rescue. That night, unable to sleep, Cassian went to the east parlor. The portrait stood on the easel, covered with a cloth. He pulled it away and stepped back, his breath catching. Serafina gazed out from the canvas with a quiet, luminous dignity. She was not smiling, but there was a softness in her expression, a depth of soul that struck him silent. Nathaniel had not painted a distant duchess. He had painted a woman of courage, of hidden sorrows, of resilient grace. And Cassian realized with a pain that nearly doubled him over that he had never truly looked at her. Not once. He had looked through her, past her, around her, but never at her. He sank onto the chair where she had sat for so many hours and dropped his head into his hands. And in the silence of that moonlit room, the Duke of Ravenscroft began to understand the depth of his own ruin. Days later, while Serafina was recovering, a letter arrived at Thornwood. It was addressed to the Duke in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Cassian opened it, read it, and his face turned to ash. The letter was from a London magistrate, informing him that new evidence had come to light regarding a document that had been placed in his possession before his marriage. The document, a letter purportedly written by Lady Serafina Ashworth before she became his wife, had been examined by an expert and found to be a forgery. A woman had been arrested for attempting to pass another such forgery in a scheme against a different noble family, and under questioning, she had revealed the name of the person who had commissioned the false letter at Thornwood. The name was Lady Marguerite Ashby. Cassian's hands trembled as he read the words again. The letter he had found in his study 2 years ago, the letter that had shattered him, the letter in which Serafina allegedly declared she would marry him only for his title and continue a secret affair, was a lie. A crafted, cruel lie, designed by a woman who wanted the title of Duchess for herself. He remembered the night he had found it, tucked inside a book in his private chambers. He remembered the cold rage, the bitter heartbreak, the vow he had made never to let Serafina see how deeply he had loved her before he learned the truth. He had buried his love so deep that he had become a stranger to his own wife. He had punished her for a crime she never committed. He left the house in a daze, riding hard to the magistrate's office, where he confirmed every detail. Marguerite had been arrested that morning. She had confessed everything, weeping and pleading, but there was no mercy to be had. When Cassian returned to Thornwood, the sun was setting and the house felt hollow and vast. He went straight to Serafina's chambers. She was sitting up in bed, her ankle bandaged, a book resting on her lap. She looked up as he entered, and something in his expression made her set the book aside. He closed the door behind him and stood there, his chest heaving, his gray eyes wild with anguish. "I have wronged you," he said, his voice cracking. "I have wronged you beyond measure." Serafina watched him, her face calm but watchful. "What do you mean?" He crossed the room and knelt beside her bed. The Duke of Ravenscroft, who had never knelt to anyone, lowered himself to the floor and took her hand in both of his. His grip was warm and unsteady. "Before our wedding, I found a letter. It appeared to be from you. It said terrible things, that you despised me, that you planned to betray me. I believed it. I believed it because I was a fool and because I was afraid. I loved you, Serafina. I loved you from the first moment I saw you in your father's garden with the sunlight in your hair, but I convinced myself you could never want a man like me. When I found that letter, it seemed to confirm every fear I had, so I shut you out. I punished you for something you never did, and tonight I learned it was all a forgery. Marguerite created it. She is in custody now. It was all a lie." The words poured out of him in a ragged torrent, and when he finished, the silence was absolute. Serafina stared at him, her lips parted, her eyes shimmering. For a long moment she did not speak. Then she pulled her hand gently from his grasp and looked toward the window, where the last light of day was fading into violet dusk. "You loved me," she whispered, as if testing the words. "You loved me, and you made me feel invisible. You let me stand in rooms full of people and feel utterly alone. You toasted another woman while I held my glass and tried not to shatter." A tear slipped down her cheek, but her voice remained steady. "I would have given anything to know that I mattered to you. Anything. And now you tell me it was all a terrible mistake, that I have spent months being broken by a ghost." Cashin's shoulders shook. I know there is no forgiveness large enough for what I have done, but I am begging you, Serafina. I am begging you to let me try to earn it. I will spend the rest of my life earning it if you will only give me the chance." She turned back to him, and the look in her eyes was not anger but a profound, exhausted sadness. "I stopped helping Cashin. I had to, or I would have drowned. I cannot simply turn my heart back on because you have learned the truth. It does not work that way." He bowed his head, his dark hair falling forward, and for the first time in his life he wept. Silent, racking sobs that he tried to stifle and could not. Serafina watched him, her own tears falling freely now. She did not reach for him. She did not console him, but she did not send him away. The weeks that followed were strange and fragile. Cashin did not push her. He did not demand forgiveness. Instead, he began, quietly and determinedly, to rebuild the world around her. He dismissed Marguerite's belongings from the guest room and had it turned into a sunny sitting room for Serafina's charitable work. He learned the names of the tenant families she cared for and began riding out with her, carrying baskets, mending fences, listening to their stories. He ordered the portrait Nathaniel had painted to be hung in the great hall, where everyone could see it, and he stood before it often, as if learning her face by heart. Nathaniel, to his credit, understood. He finished his work and took his leave with a gentle bow, pressing a small sketch of Serafina into her hand as a parting gift. "You deserve every happiness, Your Grace," he said quietly. "I have painted many beautiful women, but I have never painted one with a soul like yours. Do not let anyone dim that light again." She thanked him with a trembling smile, and when he was gone, she tucked the sketch into her desk drawer, a reminder of the kindness that had reached her in her darkest season. Winter came, soft and white, blanketing Thornwood in silence. Serafina and Cashin moved around each other with a careful tenderness, like two people learning to dance after a long injury. He brought her tea in the library without being asked. She left a single rose on his desk one morning, a silent truce. They talked long into the evenings, not about the past, but about small things. The frost patterns on the windows, the way the owls called from the wood, the new foal in the stable. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them noticed when it began, the distance between them shrank. One evening, just before Christmas, they walked together through the gardens, now bare and silvered with frost. Serafina's ankle had healed, but she still took his arm for balance. His arm was steady, solid, and he adjusted his stride to match hers without thinking. They stopped beneath the old stone archway where ivy twisted like dark lace against the moonlit sky. Cashin turned to face her, his breath plumbing in the cold air. He reached up and touched her cheek with the back of his gloved fingers, the gesture so tender it made her heart stumble. "I have no right to ask this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I will ask it anyway because I cannot bear the silence any longer. Do you think you could ever love me again? Not the man you married, but the man I want to become. The man who sees you now, truly sees you." Serafina looked into his gray eyes, and she saw the truth there. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, but a raw, aching, desperate honesty. She felt the cold air on her cheeks and the warmth of his hand through the glove, and she remembered the girl she had been, the one who had looked at him with such trembling hope. That girl was still inside her, but she was no longer afraid. "I do not know if I can love the man you were," she said softly. "But I think I am beginning to love the man you are becoming, and I am willing to find out, one day at a time." A sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sob, and he drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. She leaned into him, her cheek against the wool of his coat, and felt the steady beat of his heart against her ear. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in the quiet winter dark, while the stars wheeled slowly overhead. Spring arrived with a riot of blossoms and new green. The village celebrated the wedding of the blacksmith's son, who had fully recovered, and the whole community gathered for a feast on the village green. Serafina and Cassian walked among them, not as Duke and Duchess observing from a distance, but as two people who belonged to the land and the hearts around them. Children ran to show Serafina their ribbons. Old women pressed her hands and blessed her. And when the fiddler struck up a lively tune, Cassian pulled her into the dance, his eyes never leaving her face. As they twirled and laughed, slightly breathless, she caught a glimpse of the great house on the hill, its windows glowing gold in the evening light. It no longer felt like a cold, lonely fortress. It felt like home. That night, as they sat together on the terrace watching the last pink streaks fade from the sky, Serafina leaned her head against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her and pressed a kiss to her hair, the gesture so natural it felt as if he had been doing it all his life. "I have a question," she murmured. "The portrait, you said you did not commission it. Do you know who did?" Cassian was quiet for a moment. Then he chuckled, a low, self-deprecating sound. "I investigated. It was my solicitor acting on instructions he received 2 years ago. Instructions I gave him myself, the week after I first saw you. I had forgotten entirely. I wanted a portrait of you so I could look at you always, even before we were married. After I believed the forgery, I buried the memory. But somewhere inside, I still wanted you near." Serafina lifted her head and stared at him. "You wanted my portrait before you even knew me." "I knew enough," he said, his voice rough with old emotion. "I knew the way you tilted your chin when you were thinking. I knew the way your laugh sounded like water over stones. I knew I was lost the moment I saw you, and I was so terrified of that loss that I let a lie convince me I was right to guard my heart. What a fool I was." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. "You were a fool," she agreed gently. "But you are my fool now, and I am never letting you forget it." He kissed her then, softly, reverently, as if sealing a vow. And in that kiss was every apology, every unspoken word, every moment of longing and regret and fragile, newborn hope. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Old wounds did not vanish overnight. There were still days when Serafina would fall silent and Cassian would recognize the shadow of the past in her eyes. On those days, he did not push or retreat. He simply sat beside her, a quiet, steady presence until the shadow passed. And when she was ready, she would reach for his hand and hold it, and they would move forward together. They filled Thornwood with laughter and music. They opened the gardens to the village every summer. They welcomed nieces and nephews and friends. And eventually, they welcomed a child, a dark-haired girl with her mother's honey-gold eyes and her father's stubborn chin. They named her Hope, because it was the thing they had almost lost and had found again, stronger and sweeter than before. One evening, many years later, Serafina stood in the great hall, looking up at her portrait. The paint had mellowed, but the woman in the frame still gazed out with that quiet, luminous dignity. A small hand tugged at her skirt, and she looked down into her daughter's upturned face. "Mama, why do you smile at that painting every night?" Serafina knelt and smoothed the child's dark curls. "Because that is the woman your father learned to see. And every time I look at her, I remember that even when we feel invisible, we are never truly unseen." The little girl nodded solemnly, then skipped away to find her father. Serafina rose, and Cassian appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a tenderness that had only deepened with time. He walked to her and slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "I see you," he whispered, echoing the words he had spoken so many times over the years. "I always see you." And she turned into his embrace. Her heart full and peaceful, knowing that some loves are not born from perfection, but are forged in the fire of mistakes, loss, and the brave, stubborn choice to begin again. Together, they stood beneath the portrait, two people who had once been strangers in the same house, now bound by a love that had been tested, broken, and remade into something unshakable. Outside, the moon rose over Thornwood, and the night was soft with the promise of all the mornings yet to come.